You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Happy Thursday evening, folks. This is Scotty Roberts. Yes, it's Thursday. It's not hump day. It's not Friday. But it's that best day of the week before the last day of the week, which means you can start kind of screwing off today and get away with it. But most of us who are in sequestration, self-isolation, all of that jazz, all the businesses being shut down, if you're not keeping track, it's Thursday. And welcome to my show. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. For those of you not listening via Odyssey, that is over at odysy1.com. Go check out all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. You can also view this broadcast in its simulcast over on my YouTube channel in video. And that's over at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Mr. all spelled out. And the best part of the video chat is not so much staring at my mug for an hour, but joining the live chat room alongside this broadcast. If you're listening on radio now and are near a computer, you can call this broadcast up, join the live chat room, add your 2 cents worth in, and meet the other Intrepids that inhabit that chat room. It's a great bunch of people, nay, I would say a great family that's developed around the Intrepid radio program. So come on over and experience it. You know, we've been talking lately about Atlantis, and there's no exhaustive study to the topic of Atlantis because there's so many different theories out there. Just this morning, a good skeptical friend of mine posted something on last night's broadcast link where he said something about, of course, you know, for it being something that was created by Plato to get across a political point. I don't remember the exact words he used. And I said, well, that's one of the theories, is that that's all it was. It was an allegory created by Plato to support his political speech. And I think that's just one of the theories. I think he was obviously accessing older accounts, and he was talking about something that took place. Now, was it mythical? Was it science fiction-y? No, probably not. I think it was natural events. And we've mentioned a couple of times, it's like, and I use this only by way of illustration, it's like Doggerland, which was off the southeast coast of Great Britain, and a landmass that connected it to, I believe, to the Scandinavias and also down to France. And that was inundated by water, and it sank away. And I recently watched an archaeological program where they found beneath the water in what was Doggerland, is now the North Sea, I believe it is, and they were finding remnants of encampments, civilization, all kinds of things down there. So it's a very interesting thing when you start looking into the land masses that were covered. And one of the theories that they were covered, that they sank, was the rising oceans, which of course connects it all to nothing other than the Great Flood. Now, many of us are familiar with the Great Flood when we think of what we learned in Sunday school. You know, bathrobes and beards and sandals and Noah. Noah was a righteous man who God chose to build an ark because he was going to destroy the rest of the world due to their wickedness, we were taught. And he was going to save Noah and his family because they were the only righteous family that existed. And so Noah takes, according to the biblical account, 120 years to build an ark. And of course, people lived longer back then, according to the Bible, hundreds of years old. And so he had the time to do it on his hands. And of course, he was mocked and jeered and reviled for this. And of course, the flood came. And by the way, one of the misnomers was that Noah went out and rounded up all the animals 2 by 2, and 7 of the clean animals. I'm sure it's so they could eat and do stuff like that. But according to the biblical account, he didn't round anything up. He was there, and it says, and God brought the animals to the ark. So how much of that is myth, how much of that is literal, we don't know for sure. If there is a God that we worship the way we were taught he exists, did he have the ability to do that? Sure. But that is not a scientific response, so it's hard for some people to swallow that story as anything but a myth or an allegory. So I want to look at some flood accounts today, and we'll maybe spend a couple of days on this, but we're going from Atlantis to the Great Flood because I think there is linkage there. Now, we haven't exhausted the Atlantean topic, not by far. But I think we found that there are some good explanations out there, scientific ones, that fit the picture. So let's morph a little bit over into the flood account. And there's so much to say. I wrote extensively about the flood in a couple of my books, The Rise and Fall of the Nephilim and the History of the Reptilians. And you start looking at these accounts and you go back into the Sumerian accounts, the cuneiform tablets, as well as the biblical accounts, the Indian accounts, Indian dot no feather, Eastern Indian, and almost every culture had a flood story. Almost every tribe had a flood account that they hailed to. And there are over 600 different flood accounts. Now, do many of those overlap? Sure they do. They overlap with the same stories, but sometimes the characters change, the names change, the situations change, and so on. But linked to all of them seem to be this idea in the myths that mankind was guilty of something, and that God, or a supreme power, or a supreme race, needed to wipe out mankind through some divine catastrophe. Now, I think it was a natural event that caused these things, and divine catastrophe was added to them. Don't want to offend anybody's spiritual or religious sensibilities here, but look at it this way. Even with, like, the coronavirus, you've got mad preachers out there saying it's God's judgment on homosexuality. I was surprised that they linked coronavirus to homosexuality again. And so there was an over-spiritualizing of events. Well, we are sinners in God's eyes, and God has brought another catastrophe to shake us up and to get our attention, to snap his fingers in our face. I don't doubt that there are some religions and spiritualities that want to attest that the coronavirus has something to do with the sin of mankind. However, we find that there is a scientific reason for it. And I think this is the same thing you might have seen in the biblical writers. They've to try to explain certain events to people. They moralized them, they mythologized them, they created stories. Now, did some of these people actually exist? Did a Noah actually exist? Did he actually build an ark? Did he actually take animals on the ark? All of this is very possibly true, but perhaps in a much smaller way than you might think. Perhaps it was, I'm throwing out, this is just speculative. It's by way of example with this. I saw a documentary done on this, a Nat Geo documentary years ago that showed Noah as a local chieftain of some kind or a merchant, and he did build a big boat because the floodwaters were coming, and he rounded up all the animals, the livestock and things like that, brought them on the ark. And this saved them from this great deluge that was more regional. And, of course, they all got off the ark. They all survived this story and this event. Now, is that the way it happened, or was it a much bigger, more biblical, epic event? We don't know for sure. Certainly the biblical account offers us a very different picture. And, you know, even with the biblical account, we lose the meanings behind it. We were taught, like I mentioned in Sunday school, the sin of mankind was what brought the great flood. Well, if you read a little deeper and you look into linguistics, what's really being said in the biblical account is that it is the sin that was brought to mankind, the wickedness brought to mankind, and that the whole earth was inundated with this. In my book on the Nephilim, I wrote about how the Nephilim bloodline tainted the human bloodline. You're still talking celestial beings, celestial events, and so on. And that Noah, when it says he was a righteous man, and this is why God chose him, that he chose him not because he was just pure of heart, meaning righteous, a follower of the one true God, Elohim, but, at least according to the scripture I'm saying, but this righteousness was also accompanied by the phrase in English, and he was pure in all his generations, which we attribute to him being a righteous man. And yet that pure in all his generations was something that led into the whole mythology of the Nephilim and the tainted bloodline by celestial beings, that Noah and his family were the only pure-blooded humans that were left at that time, and that's why he was chosen. The rest were all tainted by the bloodlines of these celestial beings. Now, when I was writing about this mythology, get that straight in your head, this is biblical mythology. Now, by the way, I'm not saying you're cock-headed. I'm just saying by getting it straight in your head, get straight my meaning on this, is all I mean by that. I'm not saying this was a thing about pure-blooded races. I'm talking about humanity. The way the biblical account is written in its original linguistics, as far as we know, and can go back, it's talking about Noah being human, and pure human, while the rest of the humans were tainted by the blood of celestial beings that had come down, intermingled, the sons of God, the Bene Ha-Elohim, the Watchers, and their offspring, and that all of mankind at that time. Don't think in the multi-billions that we have around the planet today, that small regional area of the world where humanity existed, was tainted by this bloodline. This all in accordance with the biblical myth, and that this is why God wiped things out, to wipe that race out and preserve only the humans. Now, even that is full of all kinds of interpretives as you go through and you read in the language. But what I want to look at more focused today is, I'm getting too deep into all of my explanations for it. Let's look at some of the things. I got a ton of information up in front of me. So we might hop around a little bit. I will try to keep it cogent so you can follow it. There's some technical data. I want to skip this. You know, somebody I would like to talk to and have on this show is Randall Carlson with, what's his website? I'm trying to think of his website, sacredgeometry.com. If you go check him out, I would like to get his take on the Great Flood, a Great Deluge, and see what he has to say. He's a master mason, and he's been writing on these things. He writes with and does a lot of work with Graham Hancock. Be very interesting to hear his take. I'm just throwing it out there. Let's see if I can get him on. We'll talk about this stuff. So I want to look at some of the evidence of the Great Flood. Was it real? Was it a myth? Now, it's a myth. I look at it as a myth in the sense that I call it biblical mythology. This is an event that's written about in the Bible. Now, did it happen the way we think it did? Is there evidence that it happened? The story of a great flood sent by God or gods, according to much earlier testimony. And even if you look at the Elohim, they were more than one God. And we talked about that, by the way, if you missed some of those things where we've talked about the existence of even the Ten Commandments attests to the fact that there are other gods you could put before Jehovah or Elohim. And now Elohim and Jehovah themselves are two separate beings. And so Elohim is a plurality of gods. So, put forward by God or gods. The purpose was to destroy humanity for its wickedness, its sin. It's a widespread account that was shared by many religions and cultures all around the world. And many people today, if you ask them about Noah and the ark, they're going to know what you're talking about, but they may not know any of the details of that story. You can go out and buy a Fisher-Price toy for your toddler and pre-toddler that is a big plastic ark shaped like a big boat with all the little animals, and Noah, all those like weeble-wobbly type of little characters with smiles painted on them. So everybody knows about Noah's Ark. And I found it funny that Fisher-Price released toys like that because it's really supporting, in a sense, a biblical story. But they're not preaching at anybody. They're not teaching sin. They're not teaching wickedness. You just got an ark full of animals and an old guy with a white beard and his wife. So there's no shortage of tales about the Great Flood, from India to ancient Greece to Mesopotamia, and even among North American Indian tribes. As we talked about yesterday, this haplogroup A, B, C, D, and then X, which was more Grecian, how they filtered into the Americas. They brought those tales with them. And maybe they came as a result of a great deluge in their regions. So there's no shortage of tales. And often all these tales sound very similar to each other. And some of these stories truly sound so similar that one could wonder whether all cultures around the planet had experienced really the same event and wrote about it in their version of telling a tale, putting a morality story, a mythology to it to pass the tale on to their offspring. And can it be that all flood accounts, so zealously repeated around the world, are a collection of myths or isolated incidents, as the mainstream academia maintains? Or was the Great Flood a singular, worldwide cataclysm that affected all humanity at one point during our prehistory? Now, there's dating of the flood that can go back as, to 5,000 BCE, 6,000 BCE, 10,000 BCE. And when you start looking at the tales of Atlantis and Atlantis sinking into the ocean, they're talking 9,600 BCE. Well, you're looking at about the same time some of these flood stories attest that, by chronology, date back to that era. That's the less technical explanation for it. So it was cataclysm, while small, isolated disasters, regional floods, regional events can stress and frighten affected populations equally. Their overall effect is very short-lived when they are regional, and they often fade from memory within decades, if not years. And the stories fade. The stories might exist, but the events fade when they're a regional event that affects people on a small regional level. And in the case of the Great Flood, however, we have a story that seems to have no boundaries, and it's one that every culture insists on its worldwide nature. And I'm not talking about skeptics, I'm not talking about naysayers, I'm not talking about atheists, I'm not talking about necessarily the scientific community, although we'll see as we get into this topic more what the scientific community has to say. I'm talking about cultural mythology, when all cultures seem to have their own mythology of this event. Even though they change the names and some of the details, they all hail back to roughly the same time period, to roughly the same events, the same details. So how big and how destructive, though, must have been such a disaster that it managed to sear itself into our ancestors' collective memories for thousands of years. Now, judging by the shared testimony, this has to not only have been an event that affected everyone simultaneously, but in order for it to become a permanent fixture in the human psyche, it must have been an experience that persisted not only for days or months, but for several generations. If you look at the biblical tale, we hear it rained 40 days and 40 nights. But what many people don't remember is even in the biblical account, it says that they were on the ark for months as the waters receded. So this was a huge, catastrophic, great flood that flooded all the known world at the time. It says the biblical account says even the highest mountaintops. Now, is it possible that the highest mountains back then weren't as high as they are today? Did we have the Himalayas? Did we have the mountains of Urartu, the Ararat region? Did we have the Rocky Mountains? Were tectonic plates still shifting? Is that partially what caused the flood? Also in the flood, it says when it started to rain, 40 days and 40 nights, it says, and the great fountains of the deep were opened up and added to the deluge that was coming down. There is a theory that talks about a vapor canopy that existed around the earth. Now, I don't have the scientific data in front of me that establishes or substantiates this, but one of the theories that I learned very early on, and this was, yes, from a more biblical point of view, trying to establish the biblical point of view, was that there was a vapor canopy that covered the earth. And there are verses in the Bible, there's some scientific data that seems to indicate that this might have existed. And this is why you had people that were living into the hundreds, multiple hundreds of years, because this vapor canopy blocked out certain radiation from the sun. People aged much slower. And it would be as if you'd walk outside and it'd be a bright, sunshiny day, but you might see the sun and could even look at it because it's covered. You know how the sun looks when it's very light cloud cover and you can see the ball of the sun? You can even look at it without frying your retinas. And the sun is hazy. It's that kind of world, supposedly, that we existed in. And it's said that there was a catastrophic event in this biblical account where the heavens were broken open and the fountains of the deep broke open. And so there was all this that happened at one catastrophic time. And when this vapor canopy broke, this was the deluge from the sky. This was the 40 days of rain, night and day. And post-flood was really the first time humanity and people on the earth saw a blue sky, because the vapor canopy was gone. And you notice after the time of Noah, this is where even in the verses that talk about the Nephilim, it talks about the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and it's the preamble to the flood story, and it says, and God, and it says, and mankind, the years of man reduced to 120 years was the average lifespan post-flood. So it's interesting when you start looking at all those details put together. So simultaneously there was an event that humanity experienced, a geographical event, a cataclysmic event that took place, and it lasted for not only the 40 days and 40 nights, a regional event, but it lasted for days, for months, possibly even generations before the end of this receding catastrophe was experienced by people. And so we're at the end of our first segment, believe it or not. So we got to go out to break, but you sit tight. We're going to come back, pick this up right where we left off. Hey, gang, thanks for sitting on through that break. Appreciate your staying here. Good to see you here. Welcome to my program. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com to go listen to it live and find all the different outlets where you can find this radio show. And this is the second segment we're going into now tonight. If you missed the first segment, you can come over to my YouTube channel and you can see it in archive. You can check it out in archive over at Odyssey Radio. You can find it on Spreaker, on iTunes, on several different outlets that are out there. You just go check Odyssey Radio to find that. And you're watching these simulcast if you're over on my YouTube channel in video, and that's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Come and join the chat room. It's an active, lively bunch of Intrep heads that like to contribute to the show, and they get to know each other, and they care about each other. It's been a great family over the last year that's built up in this radio show, and I really appreciate and love all of them. And so come on over and join them. You'll have a good time. We left off talking about how this flood, this Great Deluge, was something that had to have been majorly... I hate using that word. Let me use a different word for that. It had to be something that was, number one, a major catastrophe, catastrophic event, something that had to be not just regional, and the different stories weren't just affecting different regions. It was something universal. It was something that hit all of known populated Earth at the time. And it was so devastating that it created all these different flood accounts from different cultures, different tribal sources, all these different events with their own characters plugged in as the Noah-type characters. We're very familiar with Noah in Western culture because of our ties to Western literalist Orthodox Christianity. And so it was experienced in order for it to become a permanent fixture in the human psyche. It had to have been an experience that persisted, not only for days and months, but for probably several generations before the whole thing was a thing of the past, before everything had receded and things reached their new paradigm of normalcy, post-flood. Now, it's not an isolated incident. If it's not an isolated incident, what known worldwide catastrophe qualifies to be called the Great Flood? Without a doubt, the significant rise of the oceans, a worldwide disaster that at the end of the last ice age erased millions of square miles of dry land around the planet, must have been the doomsday event that every culture to this day inadvertently is talking about. Imagine, if you will, say a total melting of the ice caps. Well, we've seen projected maps of how the world would change if that took place. Much of northern United States would be gone. California would drop off into the ocean. Much of the eastern seaboard would change. The Caribbean islands would be gone. Now imagine several generations down the road after such an event like that took place. If it was a one-time event or if it was a gradual thing that happened over a number of years, everything's going to be different, and that's going to remain in the psyche of humanity. And so is this something like this? The end of the last ice age erased all these millions upon millions of square miles of dry land. Again, I use the example of Doggerland because it's so easy to look that up and so easy to reference it. That area between Great Britain, Scandinavia, France, that was all once a dry plain, and now it's all ocean bottom. And it happened, thousands of years ago. So there must have been the doomsday event that every culture to this day keeps talking about in their common psyche. More particularly, it was the abrupt rise of the oceans around 8,000 BCE, which ultimately led to the flooding of the Mediterranean first, and finally to the flooding of the Black Sea. And although in 1997, a guy named William Ryan and Walter Pittman, these guys suggested that the flood of the Black Sea took place around 5600 BCE. A later study in 2005, sponsored by UNESCO, confirmed that the incident took place much earlier in time and closer to 8000 BCE. So that region went through a great deluge, a great loss of landmass to waters, sometime around 5600 to 10,000 BCE, if you look at all the different dates that can get plugged into that. The rise of the oceans was that single, long-lasting event which dramatically reshaped the coastlines of our planet, and the one which simultaneously affected every coastal civilization around the world at the time. And even when at first look, the gradual rise of the oceans doesn't seem to meet the criteria as the event behind the legend of the Great Flood, an incident responsible for the sea level to rise globally by more than 400 feet. Imagine if now the oceans globally raised 400 feet. What would happen to our land masses? And surely had many random episodes when the flooding was absolutely unpredictable. And so when considering that humans, by nature, tend to settle in lower elevations and near water, it doesn't leave any doubt that all the prehistoric civilizations were totally devastated by a universal flood of some sort. And this is why it is fixed in our ancient memories. Now, a recent study that was published in Science News, well, recently, it's about 2010, so it's 10 years ago. Recent when you're talking about 10,000 BCE, I guess. So it was titled "The Global Sea Level Rise at the End of the Last Ice Age, Interrupted by Rapid Jumps." Now, there's the title. And it better explains that after the end of the last ice age, from around 17,000 BCE through 4,000 BCE, sea levels on an average rose by about a meter, which is about 3.2 feet per century. However, the study also indicated that this gradual rise of the seas was marked by abrupt jumps of sea level at a rate of about 5 meters per century. That's about 16.5 feet. And more precisely, the study showed that the periods between 13,000 BCE and 11,000 BCE, as well as between 9,000 and 7,000 BCE, were characterized by abnormal sea level rise. And so when studying closer this abrupt climactic changes that took place during the last 18,000 years, the time between 9,000 and 7,000 BCE is of particular interest when it comes to the stories of the Great Flood. Now keep in mind, folks, we are so used to things being as they are in modern civilization. In Western culture, remember, we look at things like tsunamis, like drought, like all these catastrophes that happen around the world, and we don't think of them as being things that happen anymore. But we are in a constantly changing globe. Right now, global warming, I think you have climate change going on. You have had climate change going on for thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years. The fact that it's going on now doesn't surprise me at all. I just think you need to take the politics out of it, because it has been hijacked and exploited by those who would use natural global change, climactic change, for political purposes. And let's move that aside. I don't want to talk about politics. So as the glaciers began to melt over thousands of years prior to this period, and this 9 to 7,000 BCE, the temperatures progressively began to increase with each passing century, thus causing the melting process to accelerate. We can easily presume that this must have been the most active period in sea level rise, 9,000 to 7,000 BCE. And more accurately, the absolute worst period must have been the time around right smack in the middle of that 9 to 7, 8,000 BCE. and the critical flood cycle that preceded the flooding of the Black Sea, which really marked the end of this violent period. In fact, if past periodic ice ages and floods didn't manage previously to add salinity into the fresh water of the Black Sea, then undoubtedly the last global flood around 8000 BCE must have been the greatest flood of all time. Now keep in mind, if you don't know your geography, the Black Sea, when I'm thinking of a map, and I do not have it up here, and I don't know if I can access it quickly enough to show you. This is a little map that I made for my book on the Nephilim. I was talking about Eden and the region of Eden as the Bible describes it. I'm going to see if I can call it up for you here. And those of you listening, of course, you're not going to be able to see this, but let me see if I can find this, this Eden map. And the reason I want to show this to you is because this will show you where the Black Sea lies. And here, I've got it right here. Let me call it up for you. Ooh, it's big. Let's see if I can make this a little smaller on my screen. Okay. Now, I created this map to kind of show you what's going on here. Okay, the proportions are bad. But here you go. This is the Middle East as we know it today. And you're looking at, if you're not watching the video, folks, you're seeing a map of the Middle East. You see the Mediterranean over on the left. You see Iran all the way over on the right. You see the Caspian Sea. And the Black Sea is above that. You see right at the very top center, you see the Black Sea. Now, this is what we're talking about, that this region flooded. Now, when we were talking about, in my book, talking about Eden and trying to establish the Eden region, the Garden of Eden and all that, there's a biblical account that says the Garden of Eden was a lush area that was bordered by the Gihon River to the north, which you see on the map here, going into the Caspian Sea, the Pishon River, which runs south and a little bit west, twists around out of the Caspian, and that the Tigris River was on the southwest, and this was the region of Eden, and they named a couple of other things. Now, the land masses have all changed, of course, a bit, landmarks have changed, but for the most part, you can look at satellite pictures now of the Gihon, the Pishon, the Tigris, this region, and you can see that the ancient flow of these rivers was slightly different, but was pretty much thousands upon thousands of years ago, roughly in the same area. Now you've got the Black Sea to the north. And so this is the region that would have been, it's in what is today Iraq, the borders between Iraq and Iran. You've got the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley there. You've got Sumer and Akkad. Babylon was there. Uruk, the city that I talked about, that supposedly it was Cain, the son of Adam and Eve, who left the Eden region and went east to the land of Nod and built a city and named it Enoch after his son, which is the same linguistic word as Uruk. That was the city he built. Uruk being an archaic name for Iraq. And you can see that on the map down just before you hit the, oh damn it, there's the Red Sea to the west of the Sinai Peninsula and Saudi Arabia, and then you've got the, over on the right is is it the Persian Gulf. So there you go. There's a little map that shows you this whole Black Sea region area. Let me turn that off here. I've got there, click, it's off. All right, and so here's the big question, is that if this deluge took place, you can look at the Black Sea region and the flooding of that cycle in 8000 BCE. That whole region was flooded, and it became more salinated, salty, and this happened with this violent period. The past periodic ice ages and the floods didn't manage to previously add salinity into the fresh water of the Black Sea. Then undoubtedly the last global flood around 8000 BC was the greatest flood of all time, and it hit that region. So around that period, 8000 BCE, in addition to all the glacial meltwater that heavily flowed into the Atlantic, two enormous glacial lakes in North America burst open. The first was Lake Agassiz, 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 and later Lake Ojibwe, which one of the Native American tribes is named after Ojibways. And it began to drain into the northern Atlantic. Lake Agassiz alone covered an area larger than all of the modern Great Lakes combined. You think of Lake Michigan, Lake Erie, Lake Superior, Lake Erie, all of those lakes put together, it covered that whole region, and it receded and drained off into the Atlantic. And there was 440 square miles at the time, and it contained more water than all the lakes in the world today. And it's estimated that the outburst flood caused by the collapse of Lake Agassiz alone may have been responsible for sea levels to rise globally by as much as 9 feet. We're not even talking glacial melt-off. We're talking this region that is now the Great Lakes. What's left of Lake Agassiz is now the Great Lakes. And so the total freshwater outflow from both the lakes was so immense that not only quickly raised the sea levels worldwide by several feet, but this incident may have ultimately caused the 8.2 kilo year event that followed approximately 8,200 years ago, a mini ice age that lasted up to 4 centuries. So we're talking 6,000 to 7,000 BCE. Now with this mini ice age, and so it was during this time when most coastal civilizations around the planet were lost. The continuous rapid rise of the sea during this period by an average of 6 to 9 meters or 20 to 30 feet per century or more, along with the adverse climate changes that accompanied this phenomenon, made it impossible for the remnants of any civilization to reestablish itself. They had to move on to higher ground. And this is where you can get that glimmer of the Atlantean landmass having been destroyed around 8,000 to 9,000 BCE. And then there was a return of humanity, only after about 7,000 BCE, when the ocean levels finally began stabilizing. Human life once more began to return to somewhat of a normal. The new paradigm had been reached in climate, and humanity started to come back to normal. Coastal sites no longer had to be abandoned for higher ground, at least for the most part. And between 6,000 BCE and 5,000 BCE, once more we begin to see signs of human activity closer to the seas, closer to the coastlines. Now, is it a mere coincidence that our recorded history happens to start around this time? I'm talking about not evidence of humanity and civilization, but our recorded history starts to happen around this time. Is it true that early humans were too primitive to leave traces of their existence behind? Or the early pages of our history were washed away by the great flood of the last ice age? And after all, it seems that as soon as the adverse climate conditions receded, it didn't take long for humans to thrive again. And that's exactly what they did. They began to thrive after this. So this period of around 8,000 BCE, if you expand that out, 10,000 BCE to 7,000 or 6,000 BCE, over that 3,000 to 4,000 year period, with specific spikes around 9,000 to 7,000 BCE and 8,000 being the median point for the major catastrophes. Is this the Great Flood of Noah? Is this the story, the event that created all the different cultural stories around the globe? Is this the climate change that took place over that those centuries and millennia that spawned all these stories? Is it possible that all these stories we read about have a nugget of truth at the core? That all these events did take place. Noah did exist. Gilgamesh did exist. That these people existed, only they've been elevated to mythical form in our tales. So there is scientific evidence, by the way, that numerous myths and legends from all over the world refer to this great flood. Some stories even refer to more than one flood affecting humanity. But the common theme among virtually all of them is that gods used them as a form of punishment for disobedience, immorality, greed, and other forms of human corruption. So you can see, just like we see today, going on with, I mentioned this already in the first segment, the coronavirus. You've already got preachers out there that are preaching it's the evils of mankind, that God is now judging the planet with this coronavirus. And so, will the coronavirus be a thing of our past? Is it going to be a blip on the history? Is it going to be like SARS when that's over? 20 years ago we had that epidemic. The other epidemics around the world. It's going to be something remembered. But what if it affected all of humanity for a period of generations? It's going to be remembered. It's going to be moralized. It's going to be allegorized, if that's a word. It's going to be mythologized. Science, on the other hand, has been trying to rationalize all these events, rationalize the events of the Great Flood, searching for verification of natural disasters that could have been interpreted as acts of the gods. The Great Flood is one of those topics that's constantly under investigation by science. And now they may not call it that, they may refer to it in different terms, but it's being looked at and investigated all the time. At the moment, there are two predominant theories about the biblical story of Noah's Ark and the Great Flood. The most popular one is the flooding of the Black Sea. The theory was initially proposed in 1990 by two Columbia University scientists, William Ryan, Walter Pittman, who we just mentioned a little earlier. They were archaeologists who found evidence of shipwrecks and ancient pottery, as well as the remains of people that died in a great flood in the Black Sea about 7,000 years ago. And they estimate that more than 150,000 square kilometers of land were submerged underwater at that time. And this theory suggests that the flooding disaster may have later translated into the story of Noah and the Great Flood. Robert Ballard, he's an explorer and an archaeologist who found the wrecked remains of the Titanic, strongly supports the Black Sea theory, and he's trying to discover more proof to support it. And the second theory, which was proposed by archaeologist Bruce Massey in 2004, is that a comet crashed to the Earth about 5,000 years ago, creating huge tsunamis and weather changes that led to the flooding of many areas. His evidence is based on mythological accounts and ancient drawings, but there's no hard evidence to support his views. Now, sometimes all you have to go on anthropologically, archaeologically, historically, when there's not a written record of what happened, are rock art, cave paintings, drawings, things like that that still exist. Tales that have existed and morphed over the years. So according to the Bible, and specifically Genesis, the Ark of Noah finally came to reside on the mountains of Ararat, or as the Bible says, Urartu. And we always think Mount Ararat, the singular mountain. It was a range there, the mountains of Urartu, or Ararat. However, despite the numerous attempts, no evidence has been found of its existence. And what all these scientists don't take into account is the time frame the Bible places on the Great Flood, which is between the 2nd and the 3rd millennium BCE. Now, the Bible doesn't give you dates. That just seems to be the apparent chronology if you trace the biblical account. And I think even that is off. It's a misnomer to say that those who follow the biblical stories say the flood took place between 2 and 3000 BCE. And the fact is, there's no scientific proof that a great flood occurred specifically in that time period. Nor is there evidence to conclude that the flood theories referred to through everything we've been talking about are accurate. Yet, it seems impossible to be a coincidence that so many myths and legends from different cultures around the world refer to the same event. So, concluding for tonight, we're going to pick this up more tomorrow because there's all these different things I didn't get into. So did an enormous flood really strike the earth? If so, where and when did this flood occur? And how was humanity able to endure this cataclysm and begin again? Those are some of the big questions around the flood. Now, tomorrow we're going to talk about the similarities between the Hindu flood, the legend of Manu, the biblical account of Noah, the great flood through the Sumerian tablets, the Gilgamesh epic, the cataclysm of Ra in Egypt. And all of these things are things that we're going to hit this week. So I think you'll really enjoy it. Well, what's left of this week? Tomorrow, more than likely it'll spill over. It'll wash over with the deluge into Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday of next week. So, thanks for listening tonight. We're going to take a 23-hour break and we'll be right back. So you sit and stay tuned.